Thank you so much for your kind participation in today's GSDS weekly dialogue. Today, we have gathered here for a panel discussion on the topic Understanding Union Budget 2023 to 2024 and its impact on economy and society. As you know, in the last week, the union budget has come. So budget is something which is very interesting and everybody wants to understand. We are very honored that we have with us eminent and aspiring speakers. I welcome Professor Arun Kumar, well-known economist and a public figure who shapes the very public opinion regarding economic policies. And he has a deep public engagement, and he is one of the great public influencers, particularly in the realm of economics. We welcome Professor Lekha Chakraborty, professor at National Institute of Public Finance. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We welcome Professor Meera Chakraborty, Dr. Gyan Gului, Vijay Rao Sahab, Chief of Task Force of Society for Communal Harmony, and all friends who present here. Although both of the speaker does not need any introduction, but for the sake of introduction, Professor Arun Kumar has served or nurtured many creative minds in JNU. He taught more than 3 decades and retired in 2015. And then he nurtured Sukmaya Chakraborty Chair Professor, and currently is nurturing Malcolm Adesh Chair Professor in Institute of Social Science, New Delhi. In terms of specialization, he has specialization in public finance, Black economy, globalization, macroeconomics. And his work has been published widely in these areas, both in popular press and academic journal. So we are very honored. This is his first invitation in our GSDS forum. So thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation. And we look forward for your kind participation of today's session. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your invitation to this forum, addressing all the participants who have taken their time out. Thanking everybody for being here. I have a presentation which I'll now start. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes, it is visible, sir.
Okay, all right. So what I'll be doing is I'll be trying to present an understanding of the political strategy of the budget. So, it's a very vast subject, the union budget. So as a preliminary, what I will be presenting will be very brief, but greater details of what these terms mean are there in my books. And most recently, we have brought out a report on employment and unemployment, where we've highlighted the main problems of the Indian economy in the last few years, especially the employment-unemployment problem that faces the economy. Now, every budget has many things, and there are many positive things also in any budget. from a given perspective. But the point is to focus on the bigger picture and not just the small things that are there in the budget. So that's why, I'll focus on the macro and the strategy in the budget and analyze that here. I will not go into the micro details of the budget. So as an introduction, if you look at any budget in the last many years, what is it based on? It is based on an analysis of the current economic situation and the scenario that is likely to prevail in the coming year. So the budget is made this year for the next year. So what are the problems that we are facing now? And what are the likely problems that will come in the next year? The budget tries to look at them and try and see how they can be tackled. But there's also a larger purpose. Achha, I forgot to ask, should I speak in English or Hindi?
English would be better because
Okay,
there are
all
many
right.
participants.
Okay,
from
okay,
foreign
all
countries.
right. So, at times you want to give a direction to the economy. So the budget also helps change the direction of the economy. So in other words, these are the three things on which, we need to understand what is happening. Further, when we make any announcement, it's not that implementation will take place immediately or that the result of that announcement will happen immediately. There's always a time lag between the announcement, the implementation, and the results that follow from it. So the Union Budget 23-24 needs to be analyzed both for what it will do in the short run and the long run. That is immediately, and what it will have the impact over a longer period of time. Now, very often contradictions between the short run and the long run policies are there. And that causes failure of policies. Because if the short run is not situated in the long run, then that short run may not be achieved. And that's how the contradictions appear and policies begin to fail. Now, for the country, of course, the long term is important. But for the ruling party, it may be that the immediate short run gains that they can get from the budget, that those may be important. So what are the current economic challenges that are facing the Indian economy, which a budget needs to be addressed? There are both internal challenges and external challenges. The internal challenges are due to the nature of growth and the extent of growth in the economy. Now, the government, of course, is claiming that India is the fastest growing large economy, but that I will show is not really correct. The second is, as a result of slow growth, there is high unemployment. Also, the distribution of the gains from growth are leading to problems of high unemployment. As a result of that, there's rising inequality. And then there's a persisting inflation in the Indian economy because of supply side constraints. Then because of international difficulties, there's a balance of payment which is in trouble. And as a result, reserves have declined. Of late, the reserves have risen. But over the year, they have declined by almost $100 billion and then risen. And as a result of that, the decline in the rupee has taken place, which means that what we buy abroad, that becomes more expensive, and that causes inflation to rise. So externally, what's happening is the war in Ukraine from February 24 last year, almost a year back, and that is resulting in a new Cold War. And that Cold War is also adding to the problems of trade, of technology, and of finance. So those are the other problems that are coming from external thing, but we can't do much about the external challenges. And the only way we can deal with the external challenges is by making the economy strong. So if the internal economy is strong, then the external challenges can be dealt with. Otherwise, there'd be greater difficulties in dealing with the external challenges. So what has been the ruling party's strategy is clear from the budget. The budget has two parts. There's a part A and a part B. The part A is where the political aspect comes out, where something is offered to every section of society. However, the problems are not only persisting, but mounting, especially for the marginalized, as I pointed out earlier, what are the current problems. And why is that happening? That's happening because issues concerning the financials of the party are given priority by the ruling party rather than the general public. So as a result of that, what the government has been pursuing are what are called supply side policies. Now, supply side policies don't mean that you're increasing supply. It means you're giving concessions to businesses. So when you give concessions to businesses, then you don't take care of what the needs of the general public are. So these policies are not delivering because the demand is short. The demand is short because those at the bottom of the pyramid, they don't have adequate incomes because of unemployment, inflation, and so on. And that's why when the demand shortage is there, then the rate of growth declines. Also, what happens is when demand is short, then private investment does not rise, and therefore the boost to the economy that could come from there, that does not happen. And that's clearly visible in what happened in 2019 when the corporate tax rate was cut very sharply. The idea was that when the corporate tax rate is cut, then investment would rise and that would give boost to the economy. That's what supply side is supposed to do. Now, what happened was that the demand was short and therefore businesses used that extra profit not to invest, but to reduce their debt. So therefore, the investment rate did not go up. And because the investment rate did not go up, the rate of growth of the economy did not rise. And that is what has happened, that the private investment has not been rising in the Indian economy. It had peaked in 2012-13, and after that it came down. And of course, during the pandemic, it came down very sharply. So inadequate private investment is resulting in a low rate of growth of the Indian economy. So for supply side policies to work, demand is very crucial. And that is where the budget should have focused. But as I'll show, that's not what the focus of the budget is. Now, the problems are persisting. Why? Because the consumer confidence index of the organized sector is at about 85, while pre-pandemic in January 2020, it was at 104. So in other words, the consumer confidence is not fully recovered after the pandemic. And this is the RBI's data. RBI's data for capacity utilization is also at 72%, which is again low. And that's why the private investment has not been rising. And these data collected by the RBI are from the organized sector. These don't incorporate the unorganized sector. If the unorganized sector could have been incorporated, then the situation would have been probably worse than what is depicted by this. So the dipping growth rate is visible before the pandemic when the inequalities were there, and that has continued. So this graph shows how before the pandemic, the rate of growth was dipping very sharply. When in Q4 of 2017-18, it was at about 8%. And then by the time it was Q4 of 2019-20, which is the quarter just before the pandemic, it had dipped to about 3.1%. So in other words, the rate of growth was already dropping sharply because of these rising inequalities. And those inequalities are continuing to rise. And that's what is causing the problem. So the actual rate of growth is negative, not 7%, because the unorganized sector is not included independently in the GDP data. And in an article in the Hindu last year in June, I had shown that if the unorganized sector could be captured independently, then the rate of growth at that time was around 1%. And since then, the rate of growth has dropped, so it'd be about minus 1% at the moment. So what is happening is that behind the facade of pro-poor schemes, what is being done is to favor businesses. And therefore, the political strategy is to claim that the ruling party is concerned for the marginalized sections, but also simultaneously keep on giving concessions to the poor people. Now, this table shows that whatever are the schemes for the poor, there have been sharp cuts in them, like the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, in the scheme for the rural development, schemes for education, health, and so on. There were cuts in the revised estimates that we see for these sectors. And those sectors where the businesses are interested, like IT and telecom and transport, there the allocations increased, in fact, and increased very substantially over the 2011-12 actuals. So it's shown that what businesses are interested in, those schemes have been allotted more funds in spite of the fiscal deficit tending to rise. But those schemes which are for the poor, that is where cuts were there in the schemes. Now, as we can see, subsidy on food, fertilizer were cut, education and health were given less than the nominal increase in GDP. Rural areas which lack in infrastructure, they have been allotted less than what was allotted in 2022-23. And if you adjust for inflation, then it would be even lower. So the rural areas are getting about 5% of the total budget, whereas they are about 70% of the population, which is not to say that there are not other things that would affect the benefit the rural areas, but basically the allocation directly to the rural areas is much lower than their percentage in the population, which shows in a sense the kind of priority that we have. The Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme is allotted 60,000 crores, which is considerably less than what was spent last year, roughly about 33% less than what was there. And this is in spite of the RBI saying that only 45 to 55 days of work on an average has been available under the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in the last few years. So 100 days that is promised to a family, that has not been available. And even 100 days was inadequate. And what actually people are getting is even less than 100 days. And what is the excuse for cutting the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme? The excuse is that the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana for the rural housing scheme, there the allocation is being sharply increased from 48,000 crores to 79,590 crores. So it is expected that because of this sharp rise, there'll be a lot more employment generated there. But what needs to be seen as from the table, if you see, earlier the allocation was 90,000 crores, and that was cut to 48,000 crores, okay? And that is now being raised to about 80,000 crores. So that's still less than what was there 2 years back. So in other words, the employment generation would be less than what it was earlier. So in that sense, it is not that this scheme will be able to compensate for the decline that has been decline in the allocation for the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So the question is how to promote the rural employment. And what I see is that actually what is being promoted is unemployment in the rural areas so that the workers can be pushed to the cities. Government says that we are increasing capital expenditure very substantially from 7.5 lakh crores to 10 lakh crores. That's a sharp increase that the government claims would generate a lot of jobs. But unfortunately, a large part of this expenditure is in capital intensive organized sector jobs. And those jobs are very few. So for instance, allocations have increased for railways, for highways, and these are highly automated construction. Earlier in these construction, you'd see hundreds of people working, but now you see 5 or 10 people working with big bulldozers, big cranes, and so on. So these are very capital intensive sectors, which are not going to generate much employment. So the employment generating sector, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the rural development, those are being curtailed. So there'll be less employment there, and there'll be very little employment in the capital intensive organized sector where the capital expenditure is increasing. So in the net, I don't see that employment generation would rise as a result of this capital expenditure being raised. So what's happening is that poverty and unemployment in rural areas will rise, and that will then force the workers to migrate to the cities. And the reason why the government is interested in workers migrating to the cities is so that they act as the reserve army of labor in the urban areas and keep the wages down in the urban areas for businesses and for the middle class and the upper middle class who need workers cheap. So the marginalized in the economy are by and large losing out as a result. The marginalized segments are in the unorganized sector, and these unorganized sector has been hit repeatedly by government's policies. You see first demonetization in November 2016, then the implementation of the structurally faulty GST in 2017. And let me say that demonetization impacted the unorganized sector because the unorganized sector works in cash, and cash was short, and that's why this suffered very grievously in that period post the demonetization. And before they could recover, within 8 months of the demonetization, there was GST. So even though the unorganized sector is kept out of GST, if you have a turnover of below 50 lakhs, you don't come under GST. If you have a turnover up to 1.5 crore, then you are in the composition scheme, but you don't get input credit. And therefore, in sector after sector, demand is shifted from the unorganized sector to the organized sector. And evidence is there for the trade sector, for the FMCG sector, for the leather sector, with the textile sector, luggage industry, things like pressure cooker. In all these sectors, reports are there of demand shifting from the unorganized sector to the organized sector. So the unorganized sector has declined and the organized sector has risen, at the expense of the unorganized sector. Then in 2018, there was the NBFC crisis, which provides some credit to these unorganized sector, the small sector. And that crisis meant that credit was not easily available. That further damaged. And then the government has been forcing digitization, formalization, which the unorganized sector cannot cope with, and that further damages the unorganized sector. And then you came the sudden lockdown in 2020, which affected the unorganized sector very grievously. So in other words, what I have shown in other articles is that this sector has been losing lakhs of crores of income every year since 2016. And what this is a huge sum of money that they've lost in the last 7 years. And this is a multiple of what the government gives them annually. So what the government is giving them annually is only a few lakh crores, whereas what they've been losing is in tens of lakhs of crores. So therefore, what has happened is that these segments have declined and they become permanently dependent on government support because they've been losing incomes at a very large level. So let's look at what is the stimulus for growth. Can the growth rise as a result of the budget? The budget allocates 45 lakh 3,097 crores as the total expenditure, which is an increase of 7% over the revised estimate of 2022-23. But this is less than the projected growth in the GDP, which is 10.5%. So in other words, as a share of GDP, the allocation in the budget is less. And therefore, the percentage of GDP that will be going to the public expenditure would be less. Now, if you have less allocation, then some schemes will be cut, okay? And some other schemes which are being allotted more, they are the ones who are going to lead to more cuts in some of the schemes. So therefore, there'll be a redistribution in some sense of the allocations from some schemes to some other schemes as a result of this decline in the share in GDP. Now, the primary deficit is what adds to the demand, and that is set to fall from 3% of GDP to 2.3%. So in other words, the additional demand pumped in by the budget into the economy is actually set to fall rather than rise. The increased capital expenditure planned in the budget, as I said, most of it goes to the big capital intensive projects, and that will not generate that much employment. And unfortunately, as I said earlier, rural employment guarantee scheme, rural development scheme, education and health, there has been a reduction there. So the budget will therefore not stimulate growth because of these three factors that are there in the budget. Then let's look at the taxation related aspects, whether that will have any impact on the economy. So tax collections have been very buoyant in 2022-23. GST collection, corporate tax collection, income tax collection, they have been rising. But let us remember that all these are collected from the organized sector. They don't represent the health of the unorganized sector. For instance, GST has risen quite sharply. It's been, even above 1.5 lakh crores. It's risen in times more than 20% in certain periods. So where is it coming from? It's coming from the organized sector. As Arun used to point out, that 5% of the units in the economy contribute to 95% of the tax, and 95% of the units pay only 5% of the GST. So the buoyancy in the GST reflects the buoyancy of the organized sector. And similarly, the corporate tax collection is entirely from the organized sector, and income tax collection is also from the very wealthy and the organized sector. As the Prime Minister said in his August 15 speech earlier, that effectively only 1.5 crore Indians are paying direct taxes. That is because of the 7.5 crores who file their return, about 3.5 crore file nil return, about 2 crore file very limited amount of tax return. So it's only about 1.5 crore who are the real beneficiaries of this tax concession that is being offered. And it's an attempt to shift people from one form of taxation to another form, a new form of taxation in which deductions and concessions would be less. But the point is, the middle class pays more tax through consumption, through the indirect taxes rather than direct taxes. And the poor, of course, don't come under the direct tax net. They pay entirely indirect taxes. So what is happening is that we needed a cut in the indirect taxes if we wanted the middle classes and the poor segments to consume more and to boost the economy. But what will happen is that because of the direct tax cuts going to the upper segments of the society, the top 1.5 crore, which is about 1.12% of the country. So therefore, I don't think consumption is going to get a boost because these well-off segments, they were consuming whatever they were consuming. So even this is not likely to give much of a boost. Anyway, as per the budget calculation, only 35,000 crores of concession will be there from these taxes, whereas the total consumption in the economy at about 60% would be roughly of the order of the 300 lakh crore economy. It'll be about 180 lakh crore. So on 180 lakh crore, if there's 35,000 crore of a boost in consumption, that's a negligible amount. So therefore, we don't expect much to come out of this taxation related aspect as far as the boost to the economy is concerned. Now the question is, so what have been the priorities of the government? The priorities of the government are reflected in the allocations, as I showed in the table that I had shown earlier. But more importantly, as I said, the priorities really reflected that when the budget deficit increases, where are the cuts? What is cut and what is not cut, or what is even increased? So what we find is from the revised estimates for 2022-23, that to maintain the fiscal deficit at 6.4%, we cut education, health, social welfare, PM Kisan scheme, agriculture and allied activities, transfers to states and urban development. Now, all these are basically schemes which will go to the masses. These schemes were cut. And these cuts were taking place even though the revenues had risen by 6.8% over the budgeted amount. So actually, these need not have been cut, but where do the increases come? The increases are coming in those schemes where, as I said earlier, the well-off segments, the big business and the corporate sector are interested. There actually you see increases. So the essentials that had been cut in 2023 budget, that is where you see some increases. Okay. So those are food and fertilizer subsidies, rural development and scientific development, where you see this kind of essentials which were cut and had to be restored in the revised estimate. Second, allocations substantially increased in 2023 over earlier year's allocation in energy, in IT and telecom and transport. These are of interest to the businesses. So what is the conclusion we can draw out of this? One, the announcements do not necessarily mean that implementation would necessarily follow. So announcements may be made, but implementation need not follow. That's the first. And this is especially true for items which are of concern to the marginalized sections. Second is the heads concerning businesses have been increased even if the deficit rises. And third is heads catering to the public tend to be reduced in case deficit increases. So this clearly brings out the priority. Priority is to continue to fund those schemes even if the deficit rises where the businesses are increased, but those schemes where the public is interested, they are curtailed when the deficit increases. So this clearly shows the concern of the government, what is important to them and what is not important to them. So that brings us to the question of what is the political strategy. So the political strategy consists of two parts. One is catering to businesses, and second is marginalizing the marginals. So politically, this helps because when the marginals are marginalized, you can give some what the government now calls reveries. You can give some allocations to the schemes of the poor to show that the government is catering to them. But the marginals don't realize that what they are losing is far more than what they are getting or the schemes, because they've been losing as a result of the various policies that the government has been pursuing. What happens, of course, is that the losses appear to be hypothetical, whereas the immediate gains are visible. And therefore, people go for the immediate gains and they are affected politically by that. But the losses that have taken place over the last 5-6 years, they are not visible. That actually requires, the poor people to understand politically what's going on. So the marginalized sections which belong to the unorganized sector, they are 94%. And the strategy is to permanently draw them into the ruling party fold by giving concessions on certain schemes for them, like free food grain, like gas, and like other such items like the PM Kisan scheme and so on. What is also happening as far as businesses is concerned, I think, is a strategy that is being copied from the Korean strategy of creating chai balls. So large conglomerates are being created. So India has to depend on its own technology, but that is not in evidence. Korea actually generated a lot of R&D. And to generate R&D, India would have to give a big push to education and R&D. But as we see in this budget, both of them have been curtailed. So while we are trying to create these chai balls, the Korean strategy, create globally large conglomerates, whether it be Adani's and whether it be Ambani's and Tata's and so on. But technology development has lagged behind. Education has not received the big push that is required for that kind of strategy to succeed. What has happened is crony capitalism has been practiced, and that crony capitalism has led to a deterioration of the investment climate. Why is that? Because businesses find that if they do well, they get taken over. Like the Mumbai airport got taken over. Other assets have also been taken over by some of these big conglomerates. A large number of rich Indians, therefore, have been leaving India because they feel that the business climate has deteriorated as a result of crony capitalism, benefiting some but not everybody. So, for instance, between 2014 and 2018, 23,000 ultra high net worth individuals had left. In 2019, 5,000 had left. And last year, according to recent data, a few lakh Indians gave up their Indian citizenship and went abroad and settled down there. So in other words, this crony capitalism spoils the business environment and creates hurdles. So public sector investment, which has been increasing in the last 3 years, which was supposed to crowd in private investment, is not leading to larger private investment, both because of the poor investment climate and also because of the shortfall of demand, given the inequality in the society. So these are the pitfalls of the strategy of this dual strategy of development that's being followed. So pitfalls of cronyism have become apparent as the Adani Group shares have collapsed in the last 20 days. Their modus operandi of how they grew so large is illustrated by the subscription to the FPO that they had floated at the end of January. The FPO was initially not being subscribed to, but on the very last day, the FPO got subscribed. Now the question arises, why would anybody invest in the FPO when cheaper shares are in the market? The FPO price was around 3,200, whereas the share in the market was at about 2,700 to 2,900, which fell further to 2,100. So if I'm getting something for 2,700 or 2,900, or later on I could have got for 2,500, why would I invest at the rate of 3,200 per share? It can only be because there's pressure on some of the ultra high net worth individuals to invest there, or money was being round tripped from abroad, brought into India so that subscription could take place, or both the things were operating. And my suspicion is both the things are operating. And this is what illustrates how the Adanis became so big so rapidly. They brought in money from abroad, and they also had the help of the government in various projects that they were executing, whether it was getting funds from LIC or getting loans from the public sector banks and so on. So in other words, what has happened is that the business climate that's prevailing is being illustrated by the way the FPO actually got subscribed. Now, some people who have sold the assets like the Mumbai airport, they have denied that they were under pressure to sell. But people are scared now. The businessmen say they're too scared to talk, and therefore they would not admit pressure openly. But the coincidences are too many of how businesses have been acquired by the Adani Group, in the recent past. So to conclude, as usual, there are many things in the budget 23-24. Some of them are very desirable things, whether it be focused on MSMEs or the farmers and so on and so forth. But the point is that we should not get lost in the details, because the benefits that have been given by these schemes are far outweighed by the losses that these segments have made as a result of the government supply side policies and the mistakes made by demonetization, GST, and various other things that they have done. So therefore, we need to analyze the overall strategy and not get lost in the details of the budget. And that overall strategy is what gives the long-term perspective on the economy. And that is more important. So the strategy of the budget has been framed in the supply side framework that has been persisting. And that is at the expense of the unorganized sector and other small businesses, which have not been doing so well in the economy. And the second part is that the marginalized are permanently made dependent on the government handouts so that you can get political benefit out of this or that you're a caring government. So the impact of this growing inequality between the large on the one hand and the unorganized on the other hand is the demand is inadequate and therefore resulting in slow growth. And as I said, perhaps negative growth now, rising inequality, rising unemployment, and rising poverty. So this strategy, in other words, of this twin strategy that is being adopted is proving to be counterproductive and needs overhaul. And therefore, we need to promote development from below. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, sir, for a very deep and excellent deliberation. And it was really an excellent overview of government policies, critical evaluation of schemes, and contemporary economic crises or challenges. So thank you so much. Now, let us invite our next speaker, Professor Lekha Chakraborty, who is a professor at National Institute of Public Finance, but also involved in many eminent organizations. She is also a board of management at the International Institute of Public Finance and a research affiliate at Levy Economics Institute. So over to you, Professor Lekha Chakraborty.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Ranthir. And it was so insightful to listen to Professor Arun Kumar. And he has preempted many of my points. But again, I will try to focus on two important things. One on the budget credibility, and the other one, what Professor mentioned as the macroeconomic framework of budget. I'm loud and clear, no?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So as he mentioned, this budget was, against the backdrop of the geopolitical uncertainties. Of course, the interest rate is mounting to tackle the global inflation. And when the interest rate is mounting, when central bank is not supporting the growth recovery process, now it is a duty of fiscal policy to remain accommodative with high deficit and high debt and to support the economic growth recovery. So that's the overall macroeconomic framework in which the RBI and the North Block now function. Now, over the consecutive MPC, they have announced interest rate, and interest rate is now mounting to 6.5. Still, India is into a negative interest rate regime with mounting inflation. So to tackle the inflation, we have not reached a terminal rate of interest, but increasing interest rate will definitely affect the growth recovery process. So if this is a scenario in which the monetary policy has got limited impacts in the economic in terms of growth, what is the role of fiscal stance? That's a question, union budgets now addressing it. But the narrative is you are keeping your deficit high. It has mounted up to 9%. Now with the fiscal consolidation path, we have taken it to, around 6%. Now strictly 5.9 we pegged. But this is closely correlated to increase in the capex. And the capex will crowd in private investment. So this is the way the macroeconomic narrative goes with this budget. But as Professor mentioned, the capital spending and the investment and that boosting the economy, that happens only with a lag. And public expenditure is, of course, an important determinant of private corporate sector. But given the economic recovery, the sluggishness in the economic growth process and the sluggishness in demand, the investors' confidence is not picking up, despite we focus on increasing the capex. And over the years, if you look into, the capex remains stagnant around 2%. And with this budget, it was pegged to 3.3% of GDP. So that narrative is welcome, but we need to see that it is at the cost of cutting the revenue spending. The revenue deficit, of course, it is not phased out in this budget. Revenue deficit is not zero. But if you look into the revenue expenditure, the major, that curtailment that has happened is through the subsidies. Of course, the food subsidies, fertilizer subsidies. There is a slash if you look into and compare this year's budget estimates to the last year's revised estimates. But when you compare the budget estimates to the budget estimates, you can say that the slush is not that, significant. But if you look into the revised estimates, then the question is about the budget credibility. You know that you're supporting, poor people for next 1 year in terms of your food security. But then at the allocation, at the budget estimate level, you are not allocating it as much. And the argument given is these are entitlements and the rice-based public expenditure schemes. So definitely the revised estimates will be up. But this argument will not hold for NREGA because the allocation, of course, it is entitlement related. If more people demand, the job needs to be guaranteed. But in the beginning of the cycle, unless we protect that allocation, what is required for that scheme, then there will be a delay in the payment of wages. And then there will be problem in the way in which these programs are designed at the subnational levels. So the argument that these are entitlement based allocations, so we didn't budget at the BE level, it may not be showing that much, but in the RE definitely it will show up based on the entitlements or based on the aggregate demand, but that can affect the entire cycle of the program, and it can also delay the wage payments, which has got huge repercussions on aggregate demand. And of course, the disposable income is already low in the hands of people. So these are my quarrel with the way the government has argued it. Now comes to the budget credibility, how the government is corrected. Over the years, if you look into the budget estimates and the revised estimates, there was a huge deviation, especially related to the tax projections. Our aspirations were very huge. And also the fiscal space related to the disinvestment proceeds, the aspiration was huge. But when you look into the revised estimates, we haven't received the taxes or the disinvestment proceeds just as the way we projected. This affected the fiscal marksmanship. So how to correct the fiscal marksmanship? So now they are doing very conservative estimates in terms of this tax projections, disinvestment proceeds projections. But we have to ask whether these models or these assumptions are based on the low, below optimum level of the tax collections or the tax projections we should aspire for. But these are done in order to look into the fiscal risk and in order to minimize the fiscal risk, because fiscal risk, it has close connection with the fiscal marksmanship, and the fiscal marksmanship is not perfect. It will affect the size of the government, and as that has affected the size of the government over the years. If you look into the percentage of the public expenditure to GDP, it has come down. So over the years, the size of the government has gone down. So these are the ways in which we try to do the fiscal consolidation. And if the fiscal consolidation is happening more through adjusting the size of the government and through the expenditure compression, especially in the revenue budget, than the tax buoyancy path, then these have negative repercussions on the economic growth recovery process, and these have problems related to the human capital formation. So we are doing fiscal consolidation. Our numbers may look all right. By 24-25, we may reach to 4.5% of fiscal deficit to GDP, but path to the consolidation may be through the expenditure compression if the taxes are not buoyant. So that's a matter of huge concern. Now, we have done a study in an NIPFP with the former director Pinaki Chakraborty, and that looked into which are the parameters in which the fiscal marksmanship is affected. And that's related to, of course, as I mentioned, tax projections. It is related to this intergovernmental fiscal transfer that affects the fiscal space of the state governments. Now we have announced over the years, like, we announced that 1.2 lakh crore should be given to states to front load the capital investment, because states are also into heavy lifting capital spending. But in that articulation, we have seen that on the other side, the intergovernmental fiscal transfer in the form of grants, especially in the education, health sectors, that's coming down. And we are expecting that the matching portion of the states will be huge. And the states, these are the subjects, or the state subjects, and the state will have more entitlements and more allocation related to the state subjects. But there, the problem is, earlier, macroeconomic stabilization function was entirely done by the center government. Now, the states are equally exposed to the macroeconomic uncertainties. So, if the volatility is there in the intergovernmental fiscal transfers, that definitely will affect the fiscal space of the state governments. So, in the cooperative federalism, transferring the capital spending to the states, that is welcome. But at the same time, the volatility in the other intergovernmental fiscal transfers, that's a matter of huge concern. Now, looking to the capital spending, fiscal marksmanship over the years, they revealed that we over-adjusted the fiscal rules by curtailing the capital spending. Now, the government is trying to correct that, because the curtailing capital spending to over-adjust it to fiscal rules at 3% of GDP is now showing up the negative repercussions on the economy. So now there's a deliberate attempt by the government to focus on capex. And we think that through this macroeconomic channel of crowding in, if we are floating, infrastructure investment, that will crowd in private corporate investment. So that's the way it is done. Now, what is in the budget which is beyond GDP? There is an intention. Of course, the food security is ensured for one more year. That's welcome. And in the budget estimates, it is not clearly mentioned, because the argument by the North Bloc was it is entitlement related. So it will be definitely going up in the revised estimates. That's a matter of, which we need to argue, or which we need to debate. But here, the problem is, if you look into the discretionary fiscal space, as Professor Arun mentioned, the discretionary space is your fiscal space devoid of the interest payments. That is getting reflected in the primary deficit. So if you look into the discretionary fiscal space, if the interest payments to the revenue receipt is huge, and if it is more than 25% or something like that, then it is crowding out the space which is available for the predictive capital expenditure, or the predictive revenue expenditure. So the argument that the revenue expenditure is bad, it is recurring in nature, we need to curtail that, and to phase out revenue deficit in the long term, there is a problem with that argument, especially in the context of post-COVID fiscal strategy. Because in the post-COVID fiscal strategy, with the huge digital divide and all, we need to focus on the spending related to education and health. But as Professor mentioned, there is an episodic compression over here. If you're increasing for the housing and water and sanitation, then within the social sector budget, there's a decline you can identify with relate to education or health. So it's a kind of an episodic compression within the social sector budget. It's not that the size of the social budget is going up, but there's a kind of the reallocation from one sector to the other sector. So that's the way we have done. So the fiscal marksmanship was a matter of concern, but in this particular budget, the tax estimates, they are very conservative, they are very modest. But again, the argument is that, are we, erring on the side of caution by, keeping the tax projections at below optimum level? Because if that is the case, it affects the fiscal space that we are planning for the next FY. So that's another matter of concern, that then, we do a lot of expenditure cut. And then try to manage the deficit number. So that fiscal arithmetic and the budget credibility, of course, there's an attempt to correct, but we need to look into. Now, beyond growth, as I mentioned, food security was given importance. Gender, in infrastructure, especially access to credit by women, these are welcome. But the question here related to the cost versus access to credit. The cost of the credit, that's the interest rate is going up. And the access to the credit, even the digital infrastructure we have provided. But now in this budget, the narrative is that we do a peer monitoring model, like we form the self-help groups, and the self-help groups can have the access to the formal markets. So earlier it was done, but over the years to the digital infrastructure, we try to have the poor, direct access to the formal infrastructure, the digital infrastructure in public finance. But that has not happened. So now again we are going back to that peer monitoring models through the liquidity infusion targeted for the women. Here the problem is, as Stiglitz mentioned, if the predominant narrative of triggering the aggregate demand or to have the fiscal stimulus through credit infusion, and if the access to the credit is uneven, then we don't see a U-turn or a U-shaped growth recovery process, because the predominant narrative is liquidity infusion. Because even in the time of pandemic, when we try to calculate the pandemic package as a percentage of GDP, we couldn't do that because majority of the announcements were related to the nominal notion of the credit infusion. But that credit infusion, if that's the predominant narrative, then we need to look into the access, that who access the credit. And the credit deployment statistics from the RBI showed that there are issues with the access to the credit by the people in the low income, or in the what you call in the informal sector, or in the income brackets which is not that great. In terms of small, medium and high, if you look into the credit deployment statistics, the people who have accessed most of the credit were at the high level, but not at the small and medium term enterprises. So that's a matter of concern. Now, along with the credit infusion, we need to co-read with the tax side efforts. Of course, the tax related measurements that cannot be used for tackling the inequality or the poverty related issues. All we have announced in this budget related to some rebates, that is only availed by an insignificant portion of Indian population, because as Professor mentioned, the informal sector is huge, more than 95 or 96%. The formal or the organized sector, only 8% or 6% of people work in that. Within that, the people who pay taxes, that's very limited, maybe 4%. So whatever concessions we have announced, and we are also nudging the people to have two realms of the taxation, which again creating confusion and then simplicity and rationalization of the taxes, it's huge. It's very important. Now coming to the mobile capital, which Professor mentioned, there are tax havens. There are rich vocabulary of evading taxes. Now with the global pillar one and pillar two discussions that's happening at the international taxation level, now there should be a minimum global tax for the corporate at 15 to avoid this tax war, like nations competing for this mobile capital. But that also in India, if you look into, we have reduced the corporate taxes. And now comes the question, what is the incidence of the corporate tax? The incidence of the corporate tax, that's on labor or that's on capital. If it's on capital, then the effective tax rate, if you look into the corporate taxes, who is paying more? There is an analysis which shows that the effective taxes of the firms which below 250 crores, they are paying the effective corporate taxes more than the firms above that 250 crores level. So we need to look into the tax incidence also when we talk about the corporate taxes. Now GST, that's outside the purview of the budget. That's a GST council which we are looking into, and the multiplicity of the rates, it's creating confusion. And there are lot of things to do to rationalize the GST, and which is outside the purview of the budget. Now, going beyond the GDP, as I mentioned, along with the food security, gender, the climate change is also given adequate importance by giving, adequate emphasis to the energy infrastructure. But if you look into the allocations, whether it's supporting these promises, that's a different story altogether. For instance, if you look into the petroleum ministry, the allocation has gone up, but that allocation is to is going for, not for the energy poverty related expenditure, but it is to support, the oil companies. And I was looking into the numbers of the energy poverty issues, especially related to that gender budgeting in the energy infrastructure by providing clean fuel for the women. Of course, I can understand Professor Arun Kumar's argument that the role of the state, when it fails, we will do this compensatory programs like food security or giving fuel to the people in the low income groups. That compensation related public finance argument, it is well taken. But at the same time, in the just transition discussion, we were not focusing on the energy poverty issues, because one fine morning we cannot wake up to a country where we move from the fossil fuel to the non-fossil fuel. So what is that articulation in the international forum we have done in Egypt? Now, the preparation of the government in terms of adaptation communication, because India has prepared the first national adaptation communication against the backdrop of the Egypt COP27. And NIPFP has worked in close in this thing with the government to prepare that public expenditure requirements for the adaptation communication. And we have seen that, these are the baseline estimates, but to reach to that, the climate change commitments, we also floated a thematic bond financing of deficit. Thematic bond financing of deficit in the sense we floated the sovereign bonds linking to the green infrastructure in the last budget. But what has happened to that? There was no articulation in the current budget, but we know that there are climate bonds and these are sovereign bonds. But the channels in which the sovereign bonds are operating, that we need to take a relook, because now with the thematic bond financing for the climate change, now the arguments have started cropping up related to having human development related bond financing, like linking or earmarking the bonds to gender inequality issues. Like in the case of Argentina, they have floated gender bonds. So in the gender budgeting literature, we are looking into the sovereign bonds, which is earmarked for the gender inequality issues. So these are the ways in which it has come up. But what was absent in this budget when compared to last is regarding the digital currency arguments. Last year, we introduced a tax, which is 30%. That's a speculation. The tax related to speculation, like a casino or horse race or crypto, we have announced 30% tax rate for the crypto. But at the same time, the regulatory framework to, clean up the crypto world, to clean up the bad coins, that regulatory framework is absent. So whether the government's policy is to ban the crypto, that speculation, because the youngsters are into this high risk, high return business, to protect these youngsters and the young entrepreneurs, are we doing a regulatory framework, or are we banning the crypto altogether? So those articulations were there in the last budget, but in this budget it was absent, and we floated the central bank digital currency, thinking that it will lead to the financial inclusion because our country is largely unbanked. So those articulations were relatively absent in this budget. So overall, the path of the budget was towards the fiscal consolidation. But then, there is the tug of war or the trade-off between the fiscal consolidation and the growth process. So then on the monetary policy, we have seen even yesterday or the day before yesterday, the MPC have again increased the interest rate to protect, the capital, because the capital is flighty because US Fed Reserve is increasing the interest rates. So one, central bank, that is a Fed Reserve, increasing the interest rates, and that is catalyzing the global recession. So we are into global recession, and now it has got its own consequences on the emerging world because the capital is getting flighty, and we are also supporting that by increasing the interest rates at the cost of the growth recovery process. So these global economic headwinds and the energy price volatility and the disruptions in the supply chains, these are all getting affected, against the backdrop of these global economic headwinds, that this budget was floated. And at the same time, instead of getting into the policies which trigger the aggregate demand or support the aggregate demand, we have announced a budget which is fiscally disciplined and on the path of fiscal consolidation. And its impact on economic growth, we have to wait and see, because if this capex channel doesn't work, then we are into recessionary trend. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lekha Chakraborty, and it was really very enriching presentation, particularly the way you incorporate the question of policy uncertainty, growth recovery process, climate change, gender budgeting, and the risk indulge in GST and digitalization of the currency. So thank you so much, and I request respected participant to please raise his or her hand to share some of his or her insights or questions. Meanwhile, we can see some question in the chat box. Yes, Bijay Rao Sahab has raised his hand. So please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. The question I have is that this appears to be that the emphasis on capex for railways, highways, and other such infrastructure issues, the emphasis on that, does it not have a multiplier effect? Because I know that, as the professor has said, these are all are now become more capital intensive than labor intensive, so it may not yield direct results, but its multiplier effects, like increasing tourism, like increasing hotels and restaurants, which really employs most of the people, would that not have an effect? And the second part of the question is, should this capex not be better if it was used for building silos and deep freezers for the agriculturalists, so that at least they have the capacity, holding capacity, and their incomes would increase?
Shall I answer now or after the question?
I request you to please note down these question or queries, and you answer it. So there is a question in the chat box also by Sheikh Chakraborty. So he has a question regarding towards the social sector and promote digitalization to unorganized sector. So what kind of macroeconomic policy required to stimulate aggregate demand in economy? Does we need a Keynesian or Keckley framework? Any other friend who wants to ask any question? Yes, Professor Meera Chakraborty has also raised. So please.
I would like to ask as to what really is then the direction of economy. We find that there's 4,000 crores for tribal development, probably with an eye of appeasing people to vote for the election. That is there. But as an ordinary person, I mean, as non-economist, I find that the component people is being continuously erased. Except in the constitution, we the people, we are not the people at all. I mean, if all the concessions are given to the business houses, plus the burden of crony capitalism is on the people. So we are all the time losing. People are getting exterminated. They are becoming invisible because they do not understand the nitty-gritty of the budget. So therefore, why should we bear this kind of a burden? And what is then the direction of the economy? I fail to understand. Did you find that the earlier budgets can be called as people's budget, because government is claiming that it is people's budget? So people are not at all visible there. Do you find that the earlier budgets have tried to really help people instead of exterminating, as this budget is clearly doing? So because I found that even as a Karnataka State Women's Commission member, I found that the block development officer was collecting from the women, or the pension that she gets is 25 rupees. The 5 rupees is going to the block development officer. What kind of thing? How do I find a direction? How do the women find a direction? When we do, how do we call them as people budget? Is there no solution? Can we not call them back? The right to recall the representation if they fail to serve people. This is my. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm just exasperated with this kind of extermination of people at all level. At all level. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. Sayak Chakraborty, yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah, I have a question that Professor Arun told that that government cut health spending on education, health sector, and Magnera, Mahatma Gandhi National Employment Guarantee Act. So my question is, what kind of macroeconomic policy that we need to boost the economic development as well as growth? Does we need a Keynesian-Kaliski framework or any other kind of liberal policy? Basically, we see in the budget that government focus on the supply side policies, not demand side oriented policies. So
Okay.
what kind of policy? And another question is that government focus on the fiscal consolidation. Government try to reduce the fiscal deficit. So it cut the spending. So does it affect unfavorably to the poor section of the society?
Okay, so I request Professor Arun Kumarji to answer these queries.
So, the basic question that Vijay Rao ji asked was whether, the capex for, capital intensive sectors like railways and highways, etc., whether that has a multiplier which would then benefit. All capital expenditure would have some multiplier, right? So it's not that only railways and so on would have multiplier, and there'd be other round effects, he said, in tourism and so on and so forth. But there are other round effects of everything, So I think if we compare, the question is, what is the basic problem facing the Indian economy? And the basic problem, as I said, listed out earlier, was unemployment, inequity, and so on. If we are to address these things, then we have to address the expenditures at the level of the poor people. And that's why I focused on rural development, on education and health, where employment generation would be higher, So to me, the basic problem that faces the Indian economy, that is what needs to be addressed. And what I tried to show was that in the 2 or 3 ways that the government says that it will generate more employment, actually the employment generation will reduce because you're cutting expenditures precisely where employment generation is higher, in education, health, etc. And that also has many backward and forward linkages. It's not only in the case of transportation or telecom that that backward and forward linkages are there. So to me, it appears that the strategy being adopted is counterproductive, that it would reduce employment generation. And that brings us to the macro. When the demand from the 94% declines, because that 94% in the unorganized sector is declining, then overall growth declines. The investment rate in the Indian economy, which had peaked in 2012-13 at about 36%, had come down to 30%. And why? Because demand was short. And as I pointed out, that the demand, remains short even now. Rather than compare the rates of growth of the economy, what we need to do is we need to look at the level of GDP. And the level of GDP now is only 8% higher than in 2019 before the pandemic. That means we've been experiencing an average of 2.75% rate of growth in the last 3 years. which is very low. And as my graph showed, that trend had already started even before the pandemic, that the rate of growth had been dipping. So what we need to do is, to answer other questions also, is to generate demand in the economy, for which consumption has to be boosted, and consumption where? Not at the upper ends, at the lower ends, where the incomes have been inadequate. And this 5 kilo scheme that has been continued of free food grains to 80 crore people, actually, earlier 10 kilo per person was being allowed. Now only 5 kilo will be allowed, because the two schemes are being merged, where 5 kilo will be given free, but the 5 kilo that was being given at 3 rupees and 2 rupees, that's going down. And my calculation is that the individual on an average needs 13.5 kilograms. So earlier they were buying 3.5 kilograms per person, per month from the market. Now they'll have to buy 8.5 kilograms. And now the wheat prices and the paddy price, the rice prices have shot up, because the wheat crop was less, the paddy crop was less, and therefore they'll be having to buy 8.5 kilograms at a raised price. Therefore, the poverty will actually aggravate, and that will then lower demand. So the high inflation that people have faced has also been lowering demand. So therefore, what we need to do is we need to curb inflation, and for that we have to lower the indirect taxes, like for instance on petroleum goods and so on, because those are basic energy prices, and if you raise the energy prices, then inflation kicks up. And when inflation kicks up, then the unorganized sector demand comes down. So controlling inflation by lowering the energy prices, and the Indian oil basket, we have been getting oil cheap from Russia at $25 below the pre-Ukraine war price. So the average purchase price had actually come down, and because the average purchase price had come down, we could have lowered the price of energy, petrol, diesel, and so on. So that would have helped in controlling inflation. And the tax that is lost as a result, the excise duty loss that takes place, could have been made up through direct taxes. And anyway, direct taxes were buoyant. So therefore, there was an increase in the revenue collection that took place. So my point is that, the whole strategy of the government, in which they're trying to create disparity by boosting businesses and cutting back on expenditures on the poor, that is a wrong strategy. The strategy has to be that you give a boost at the lower end of the income pyramid, where the incomes have stagnated or declined because of inflation. If you do that, then demand would come up. When demand comes up, then capacity utilization would come up. And when capacity utilization comes up, then growth would kick up. Simply spending more on the capital intensive items is not going to raise the consumption demand. It'll have very little impact on the consumption demand. So from a macro perspective, it is very important that we change the strategy. That's what my conclusion is, that the present strategy is very counterproductive, and especially trying to make some big conglomerates like the chai balls. That is a strategy which the failure of which is being seen in the way Adani shares have collapsed, and that is hitting the investment climate in the country. Foreign investment, would be hit. Already we see that the French, the total, they have postponed their investment along with the Adanis. Other companies also that may have come in with the, Adanis or big business, they may also halt their plans until there's greater certainty. So I think what my overall thing is that look at the overall strategy. And that's why I didn't go into specific schemes. The overall strategy is what we need to look at, because that's what the long term is important. If the overall strategy is incorrect, then in the long run, we will not be able to get what we think we are getting. And as I also said, the rate of growth of the economy at the moment is not 7%, but minus 1%. And that is because the unorganized sector is not captured in our GDP data. The agriculture sector is captured only partly because it is assumed in the quarterly data that the targets for agriculture are fulfilled. But this year we know that the targets for agriculture are not fulfilled. In the first quarter, the wheat crop was much less because there was early heat in the month of March, April, and therefore the wheat crop was less, the fruits and vegetables crop was less, the milk production was less. So agriculture didn't grow at 3%, which is what the GDP assumes. Actually, agriculture declined in the quarter one. Similarly, in quarter two, it's assumed that the rate of growth was 4.5%. But actually here also the growth was far less, for the simple reason that the paddy crop, the acreage was much less because the rains were delayed in the paddy growing areas in the month of June, July, August. And then there were excess rain in the month of October, November. So therefore the paddy crop is also much less. So this year to say that agriculture will be growing at 3.5%, that doesn't make sense. And similarly, to assume that the organized sector can proxy the unorganized sector, that's also incorrect, because the unorganized sector is declining. As I gave the information, I mean, look at the e-commerce. E-commerce is growing at 30-40% when the economy is already growing at 2.75% on an average. So that growth is only at the expense of the neighborhood stores. And e-commerce is far more automated than the neighborhood stores. So therefore, employment is declining as a result of that in that sector. Similarly, if you look at the Hindustan Unilever report, annual report this year, they say our market share has gone up because the small sector is not able to cope with the situation. Similarly, in the pressure cooker industry, the chairman said that we have 30 units, 5 in the organized and 25 in the unorganized sector. And the 5 units that are there in the organized sector, our demand has grown 24% because the unorganized sector is not able to cope. You look at the RBI data on 2,700 companies, and these 2,700 companies are non-public sector, non-financial companies. Their sales increased 41% when the economy was growing at 2.7%. So the 41% is at the expense of the unorganized sector, and the profits grew at 24%. So when the economy is stagnant and their profits are growing at 24%, it means the pricing power of the organized sector has risen because demand has shifted from the unorganized sector to the organized sector. So, what I've been arguing is that we have invisibilized the unorganized sector in our data. And therefore, when we say that the rate of growth is 6%, 7%, and is the fastest growing, then we don't need to do anything specific in policy. And that's why we don't do anything specific to micro sector. We must realize that there are 6,000 large units, 6 lakh small and medium units, and 6 crore micro units. And the micro units employ 97.5% of the MSME employment. And when the micro sector is being hit very badly, the small sector is being hit very badly, that is why unemployment is increasing. And that data is not captured. That's why the labor force participation rate in India is very low. Compared to other similar countries like Brazil, China, and so on, where it's 65%, our labor force participation rate is 45%. That means we have 20% less people counted in the labor force. And therefore, that affects our GDP, that affects our growth. So unless we create a lot of jobs, and in our report, which I told you in the beginning, that we have produced a report on employment, unemployment, we have shown that 320 million have proper work, but 280 million don't have proper work, for whom we have to create work. If we created work for these people, GDP would go up by 16%. And the wages that we need to pay these people is only 5%. So therefore, it can be self-financing. But the problem is that the government is not focusing on the unorganized sector, and the organized sector is colonizing the unorganized sector. Because what used to happen is that during colonial period, the colonial powers would capture the market, okay? And therefore the local market would suffer. Similarly, the organized sector is capturing the market, and therefore the unorganized sector is suffering, okay? So therefore the whole focus of the policy has to be, if we are to grow and if we are to take care of the poor people, then we need to focus on the micro sector, we need to focus on incomes in the rural sector, and these are precisely the areas that are not being focused on. And that's why I said that the strategy that is being adopted by the government, the twin strategy of creating this divide to capture these people politically, the mass, and to benefit the big sector, that policy is not delivering the results that it needs to deliver for a better distribution, for less inflation, for more employment generation. And therefore, this needs to be changed for development from below. I think this sort of captures many of the questions that have come.
Yes,
Whether this budget is better than or worse than the other budgets, I'm not saying that this budget is worse than the other budgets. Other budgets also has a similar issues. But this budget takes it to one step higher, as the Adani episode points to.
Arunji, you made some very good points, but just to be the devil's advocate, from 1950 onwards, this logic of saying that we will do for the poor, etc., has not really resulted in a significant growth for the country. So what would you argue to such a argument?
No, if you look at the growth rates in the Indian economy, between 1901 and 1951, the average growth rate was 0.7%. Okay, that increased sharply in the 50s as the savings got increased and you got to about 4% rate of growth. So there was a huge acceleration in the 50s of the rate of growth. Then, because of the policies being, trickle-down policies that we followed right from independence, you ran into problems one after the other. But from 1980 onward, you stepped up the deficit, and that raised the rate of growth to 5.1%. In the 90s also, you had 5.2%. So there was no significant step up in the rate of growth of the economy with the new economic policies. In fact, what I've been arguing is that the increase in the rate of growth in the Indian economy is a composition effect. The agriculture sector cannot grow at more than 3.5% per annum, but services can grow at 9-10%. And the share of services has been rising. And that's why through the average that you take, the average rate of growth would increase. But now the problem is that you see the demand problem has affected us, and the demand problem has affected the global economy also. And that's why the World Bank is now talking about the universal basic income. And our chief economic advisor in 2015 also talked about the universal basic income, because it's being realized that with growing automation, growing use of artificial intelligence, etc., very few jobs will be available. So large number of people will not have income, and therefore demand would be short. And that's why give something in the hand of everybody. That's the universal basic income idea. But I'm opposed to the universal basic income idea, because if you give money in the hand of people without work, then work is what gives dignity. If you just give money, the dignity doesn't come. And therefore, if you have some money to give people in the hand of people, use that to generate employment. And through employment generation, so in other words, what I'm saying is that technology has to be introduced in a socially responsible manner. And I think that's what Gandhi meant when he was saying about technology, that technology has to be socially responsible so that everybody has work. And that is the aim that we should focus on.
You're absolutely.
Thank you. Yes, so I request Professor Lekha Chakraborty to also add some of her observations regarding the questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Vijay Rao and Meeraji, for your questions. That basic question you asked is where to? Meeraji asked the question, where to? What is the strategy? So let me begin from there. I can understand that anguishness that happened in you related to the way in which we frame our macroeconomic policies. Here, the inflation is mounting. We need to do something related to inflation. So as per the new monetary policy framework, now RBI is given the mandate to look into the price stability and to control the inflation. But inflation hurts poor. RBI alone is not able to tackle the inflation, despite the interest rate is now moving up. Now it's 6.5, but the inflation is not contained because inflation in India is not strictly a monetary phenomenon in which the RBI policy rates hikes or policy rate adjustments can maneuver the inflation. Inflation has supply side shocks as well. So fiscal policy, the budgetary policy, has got an important role to play over there. And what is there in the fiscal policy or in the budget policy? What is that fiscal measure to tackle or to face this issue of inflation? That is absent in the budget. So only what we announced is the food grains that we will extend to one more year. But inflation is strictly RBI's mandate, and fiscal policy will look into the growth recovery. So this dichotomy is creating problem because inflation is equally the mandate of the budgetary policy makers. So that's one thing. Second, inflation is mounting, interest rate is mounting. So what the fiscal policy needs to do for the growth recovery process and human development and the capital formation in the economy. So that was the question. And the way we have done in the Indian economy is keeping the deficit and debt very high. And now the fiscal risk is showing up and they are into the path of fiscal consolidation. So there is a huge expenditure compression over here. And over the years, the size of the government has shrunk. And that's a matter of concern. Now, how to enhance the fiscal space, or what should be the narrative of the enhanced fiscal space? Do we focus on the participation income in which people come out, do the work, participate in the economy, and earn an income with dignity, as Professor mentioned, or will we support Indian population with the basic transfers? Because basic income transfer or the cash transfer, we didn't go for that policy. Of course, that is not warranted also. But of course, the way we think that it triggers aggregate demand. But given the propensity of the people to save the money than to spend, even the cash transfers cannot stimulate the economy. So all what heterodox economists, Professor Arun Kumar and me belong to the heterodox school of thought. We believe that the employment policy through the minimum wage revision is the solution for, what Indian economy is facing right now.
Yes, thank you. So we have just touched our time. So thank you everyone for your kind participation, and we can see some distinguished person, Dr. Balmi, Dr. Gyan, and Professor Anand Kumar has also joined. So I can request Professor Anand Kumar if he has some comments or suggestions.
It's been a very informative and educational session for all of us with the help of these two very outstanding economists of our country. In the popular media, for example, in India today, they claim that this budget is job-oriented, is going to give boost to the job-seeking people. But Arunji and Lekhaji both are telling us that it is ignoring the unorganized sector. It is prioritizing the organized sector, particularly big business. Is also aware that this is going to be election-oriented year, and they are not ignoring the demands of the popular nature, particularly the food needs of the millions of the people. We are very thankful to both of them, as well as for the people who contributed with their questions. And Gandhian School for Democracy and Socialism at IITM University, Gwalior, is very obliged to all of you for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. And on behalf of GSTS, we are very grateful that today we have really understood path-breaking insights, not only just economic, but also policy. So understanding budget is also one of a task of citizen. So this recorded video will be circulated among the students and public in large. So thank you everybody for your kind participation, Professor Chakraborty, Dr. Gyan, Vijay Rao, and Dr. Arun, and Professor Lekha Chakraborty. We look forward for your kind participation, engagement in our coming dialogue and discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.